Today's webinar is Drupal for Project Managers, Part 1, Kickoff and Planning, with my colleagues Adam Boyson, who's an engagement manager at Acquia, and Heather James, who's the manager of training here at Acquia.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, very good. I can hear you.
All right.
So as Hannah's introduced us, this is what we look like, if you could see us. And just to give you, for the folks who've joined us and are probably watching the recording as well, we're going to cover the kickoff and discovery phases of project management. So we're going to follow the project life cycle throughout the 4 parts of this course, so you can actually understand, hopefully, a little bit about what's going to be happening. And in fact, we're actually going to cover estimation at the end. You think you would start with it, but it's probably better we actually sort of address it at the end. The course and the topics that you'll see are based on real-life examples and what we know from other people who've shared a lot of project management knowledge within the community. There's a really great and growing community around project management. And the whole course is really about you as a project manager and how important your role is. And so I thought it'd be a really great way to start this session to hear from you, Adam, about your role as a project manager and what you do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Heather. So as Heather mentioned, my name's Adam Boyson. I'm an engagement manager with Acquia. I've been with Acquia for a little over 2 years. I think we're going, just over 2 years. Prior to that, I had a similar role at a digital services consulting firm. I didn't, frankly, have much of a Drupal background before joining Acquia. So it's certainly been an exciting ride over the last 2 years to be a part of the rapid growth of Drupal and Acquia as a whole, and also to be privy and a part of the opportunities ahead of us with Drupal. I kind of point out the fact that I didn't have much of a Drupal background coming into it, because I think particularly as PMs within Drupal projects, and the fact that there are a lot of sort of homegrown agencies, and the community obviously being an integral part of of Drupal as a whole, not just our projects. There's a certain assumption by a lot of clients that we, as project managers, we're actively involved in the community, have a lot of exposure even to the technical side of things, and that's not necessarily always the case. I think with being a project manager with any project, whether it's engineering or web content management, it's good to have that context, but not necessarily always a prerequisite to being successful in your role. So I guess kind of backing that up, generically speaking, my role within any project is really to assume responsibility for the successful planning, execution, monitoring, control, and never to be forgotten closure of a project. Obviously, that's gonna shift a little bit with each agency and how they put their spin on what project manager role means within their organizational structure. From an Acquia standpoint, we have a large network of partners that we work with, and that sometimes adds a different spin to the role, just given how we engage in our projects and with our customers. But that's sort of a high-level overview of my role.
I suppose you, being at Acquia, like you said, we see project managers at various partner agencies, and we also see project managers in the context of our clients as well. I mean, do you sort of see a differentiation between, the scale of an agency or the scale or size of a client in terms of what a project manager might do?
I think obviously your resource makeup within any organization is going to have some impact on your roles and the breadth of your role, and how kind of concrete and well-defined your day-to-day activities are. I think certainly within much larger organizations, if you work for a Microsoft or an Amazon, obviously your role is probably fairly siloed, but as we all know, in smaller firms, your project manager is oftentimes involved more heavily in the pre-sales process and other business development activities, and a lot more than just managing the day-to-day activities or of a project or multiple projects. So I think it really just has to do with kind of how much you focus on one particular competency versus the needs of a smaller organization. being that of somebody with a broader skill set and sort of jack of all trades. So I think that's probably the biggest point of difference. But as far as the project manager role and that competency within any project, I think it's fairly similar. It's just probably how many different people are tugging at you at the same time.
That's how many different projects you have going at any one time. It seems to be, as we were doing research for the learning material for this class, that everything really hinges on the project manager, whether or not it's successful or not. So there must be a lot of pressure, I can imagine. So we'll move into talking about, what we're going to talk about today is really the kickoff, and then we're going to lead into the discovery phase. And I thought just by starting off, you could sort of tell us what exactly is the kickoff? Where does it start and end?
Yep. I don't know that I'd actually refer to it as a phase. I think you're setting yourself up for basically a lot of loose ends, when starting your project by referring it to a phase. I think I'd probably say it's more of a milestone, with the goal of a kickoff being to bring everyone up to speed, and then over the course of your project kickoff, whether it's a 2-hour meeting or a week on site, I think the goal really out of the kickoff is to, like I said, make sure everybody is starting off on the same page, and then ultimately leaving the kickoff meeting or meetings with as many of those loose ends tied up as possible. From that standpoint, I would say at the beginning and end of the the milestone are mostly constrained by the meeting times. And like I said, that's more just from the standpoint of not wanting to leave the kickoff with you obviously have next steps and probably some important takeaways, but everybody needs to be on the same page that you are you're moving forward. And elongated kickoff often results in and delays in project schedule and things like that.
Right, okay. And we talked a little bit, as we were preparing for this, about the risks in the kickoff phase. Can you give us examples of risks as well, risks in any kickoff phase, but anything that comes to mind about something specific to Drupal as well?
Yeah, I think with the kickoff, it's important to, focus on the positives, and that, with any, you're going to have risks that come up, and you're going to have to consistently mitigate those risks. But I think the point really with the kickoff being that no matter what, you're going to benefit from a kickoff meeting. I don't think anything's going to come up during a kickoff meeting that is going to, in and of itself, pose a significant risk to the project. And if it does, then you're somewhat fortunate that you found out about it at that point, as opposed to further down the life cycle of the project. So while I'd say it should be perceived more of an opportunity than a risk that could impact the project as whole, I think that's probably how it should be perceived. However, if we're talking risk to the productivity of the kickoff call and the value that you actually get out of the kickoff, then there's a number of things that can impact the effectiveness of the kickoff. Some of those things being stakeholder attendance. Obviously, if you don't have all the right people at the table, that can certainly affect your productivity and accuracy of communication. Lack of setting a baseline understanding of what's trying to be accomplished. That's certainly a risk when you have people coming to the kickoff with different understandings of what you're trying to even accomplish. I think, Heather, when we were talking the other day, I alluded to an example where I started a kickoff meeting, and a fairly high-level stakeholder kind of first question he asked during the first session was, I didn't even realize we selected Drupal for this. And that certainly is a risk from the standpoint of derailing not just your agenda for the day, but certainly forcing you to take 2 steps back before you can take a step forward. And I guess some other risks would be ongoing contractual negotiations. I think obviously everybody wants to be in a position where all of that is ironed out and signed off on before you conduct any real project-related activities, but there are special circumstances at times, and just given deadlines and things of that nature that require you to to get moving as quickly as possible. And if some of those things are still in flux or up in the air, that certainly poses a unique set of challenges.
Yeah, I read something recently about trying to find the invisible customers or invisible clients. So you may be talking with some people in an organization, yet you discover later on that there's some people in sales or marketing or that have like undiscovered opinions, needs, and have you ever run into that kind of hidden agendas and such before?
Yep, I think that probably alludes to another point that we'll probably cover in a little bit more depth once we get into talking a little bit more about discovery and things like that. And that's making sure that the entire project team, no matter the the level of involvement, anybody that has a touch point with the project plan, needs to be part of those discussions and a part of the kickoff, because they're not always a part of the pre-sales estimation calls. And you're right. There's within just about any organization, there's always some level of politics, and as project managers, we try to remain as independent of any of that as we possibly can, and I think part of that is just making sure that that everybody's around the same table and able to speak their opinion.
But that's a danger. Yeah. You never know what's happening.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I sort of asked before, but I'm just curious, because there's folks, I know some people are attending, they're in small Drupal agencies, working on their own, probably wearing a lot of different hats, and then I know there's some folks who are attending from really large organizations. I mean, are there any major differences in how you conduct that kickoff meeting and what you have to set out at that time?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question. I think the agenda itself doesn't differentiate greatly from large projects, small projects. I think it's more the depth and detail at which you cover certain things. A good example of that being your communication plan. That you want to cover off on in your kickoff meeting. If you're talking about a group of 6 people that compromises your project team, stakeholders, and things like that, then obviously your communication plan can be relatively straightforward. But if you're talking about a project team from both the client and the partner and sides of things, then you can get upwards of easily towards 50 people, and that's something that obviously requires a much more thorough and documented communication plan with a lot of different roles on the project and a lot of different responsibilities. I think it's more about the depth at which you cover things. Obviously, it would take you a lot longer to communicate and cover off on a communication plan for a large project of 50 people than it would 4 or 5. But I think the agenda itself, for the most part, remains the same. It's still the same risks and business objectives and change management and all those things that you need to cover off on in any project.
Yeah, actually, that leads really well into the next question about the resources. I'm going to share, since you're able to get this online, we'll be able to share this with people after this session so that they can look at this example kickoff agenda to see the kinds of resources that you actually use. I know this isn't specifically an agenda, but what you did is, maybe you can tell us what you've done here so we can sort of see what we're looking at.
Yeah, so this is obviously pretty high-level stuff. I think the one other thing I just before we quickly segue to, I guess, the agenda here, the other thing I'd maybe point out is just I think the larger the project, the more important it becomes that your kickoff is face-to-face on-site meeting. And that's largely because you're going to have people that have roles in the project that maybe are just involved in one minor component to the overall delivery, and and they might only have a small interface with the overall project team, and you certainly want to have that opportunity to still make them feel a part of the team, because they are absolutely an integral part. Everybody has an integral part in the successful delivery of the project, but lots of times, just if they do have a smaller role in projects, they can easily forget about maybe communication tools that you use and modes of just discussing more about the communication plan and having that face-to-face where you can kind of force everyone to be around the table, I think really assists with that. As far as the agenda, like I said, this is fairly high level, but covers off on a lot of the things that I think just about every project would need to touch upon in a kickoff meeting. Just to kind of start at the top, I think I always like to just set up some baseline expectations with an overview of the project, and when I say high-level goals, referring to high-level goals that of what you're trying to accomplish in the kickoff meeting. I think, as project managers, that's a fairly straightforward expectation, that with, any meeting you want to set your clear expectations for goals and achievements that you'd like to accomplish.
Actually,
go ahead.
Would you have this filled out ahead of time, or is this something you'd work on during the meeting? I'm curious how large or how long, when you finish the kickoff meeting and you have your communication plan and your methodology and the project schedule, et cetera. I mean, how long are these documents usually? How many pages do they end up?
The communication plan, the template that I typically use is a couple pages without any of the information filled in. So I think I've outlined a couple components to the communication plan. Ideally, though, to answer your question, Heather, these are things that before the kickoff meeting, I will want to work directly with the client stakeholders to iron all of these things out. Once again, reiterates the need for having a counterpart within the client's organization that knows how the communication plans work on their side of things, and who the responsible parties are and the stakeholders that need to be notified. I never pretend to think that I know our customer's organization as well as they do. And I should, that's kind of a major pitfall if you ever make that assumption. So I definitely, before the project kickoff, work directly with the kind of core project leadership to make sure that we iron out what is the communication plan, and talk about all these things in advance. Because really the kickoff in the larger setting is more of an opportunity to relay processes, protocols, things like that to the broader project team, more so than an open, roundtable discussion for how people want to go about doing these things. They're really things that should be ironed out and more or less communicated. So the communication plan is something that I would have, developed in advance of the kickoff call, and we're certainly always open to feedback. And I'd say it'd be kind of strange if you didn't receive some level of feedback, but at least having the cornerstone for all of these documents in place is a good thing. And with the communication plan, really what we're trying to establish there is the communication channels and tools that are being used, whether it's Basecamp for storage of documents and various messaging, or Skype for IM, basically just setting some protocols for how.
Really popular, well, isn't it?
Sorry, I missed that, Heather. What did you say?
Even having open Skype channels and making sure everybody has access to them. I know that something as simple as that is used.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, because everybody, sort of on larger projects, smaller teams kind of find their own, optimal modes of communication, which, it's great that everybody is, being communicative and whatnot, but it's important that other people are aware of those discussions, and you have kind of the proper tools to support that. And that's where, once again, it's just agreeing on what are the processes and tools that are going to be used. Yeah,
there's nothing. I mean, at this point, and I know we're going to go and talk about discovery. There's nothing specific to working with Drupal here. This is, like you said, this is all just getting process set up. One of the funny things, notes from when we talked before, is you said the biggest risk in kickoff is not having a kickoff and sort of assuming that, oh, you don't need to talk about holidays and vacation, what if a stakeholder's literally out of the room. But this seems to be something that would be relevant no matter what CMS or what framework you were using, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's just, I mean, it doesn't even have to be CMS. I think it's just an underlying, important concept of project management that, should be with any project, whether it is, whether it's Drupal or some other CMS or, even, if you're building a ship, it's still all relevant stuff.
I noticed at the bottom of the document, and I think this comes back to more relevant to Drupal itself in a way, is the issue of change management and making agreements, as you were saying, about what if we've made agreements about something that's a feature set that's going to be available, and then through discovery or through some type of development process we figure out there's a better solution, or the client wants something else. I mean, can you say more about that process? I'm going to go back to the document just because I think there's some good notes there, but how does that process?
I wouldn't hesitate to say that change management is the most important thing to be talked about in a kickoff. I think a lot of that is, the real value of discussing change management during a kickoff is to establish a process and corresponding tools and anything else that goes along with that. That makes everyone's lives a lot easier when you're fully engaged or midstream, on a project. Not establishing that change management protocol early can lead to a halt in the project when change is actually recognized versus triggering a predefined process that everybody is already aware of, comfortable with. The change management plan that I pretty much provide every single customer is fairly detailed with what the process flow looks like, who the notified parties are when change has essentially been recognized, and what the escalation path is for going through that change process, and who the responsible parties are for approvals, estimation, and things like that. And the other thing that I really like to hit home just real quick with change management, another reason why it's important to do that at kickoff is just reiterating that change management is a responsibility of every single person that's involved in the project. As a project manager, I am obviously familiar with the scope, but not maybe at the level of detail, particularly from an estimation standpoint, as various individuals on the project. And so, you really want to communicate that as soon as somebody acknowledges that something is different than what they expected it to be from an estimation or a scope standpoint, that they raise their hands, notify you, and then you can proceed with the process. And that's, an important thing that you can establish during a kickoff that might be much more difficult to establish further down the line.
I wonder, really, I wonder if you could get specific. I'm kind of curious, I can imagine it can come from, say your own team side. A developer may have, we'll talk about in discovery, of course, but, maybe underestimated something which was different. Or, say, for example, it comes from the client side. Can you think of an example? I'm just curious of, if you can speak anonymously, of sort of a bad case where change control wasn't in place.
Yeah, I'll kind of answer your question somewhat indirectly, and that another purpose of reviewing the change management plan is to remove any preconceived notions about what a change order really means. From a client's perspective, change order certainly often carries a negative connotation. And that's the opposite of what we really want to communicate as project managers. Change management ultimately helps the project succeed as a whole and guarantees that the client will receive the greatest value for every dollar spent. And oftentimes, when I sort of position that during a kickoff call, the one of the main stakeholders to raise their hand and say, well, give me an example of change management that doesn't cost me more money. There's certainly a host of examples that you could provide, but one would just simply be, whenever we estimate things, we assume that certain things are going to take longer than expected, certain things are going to take less time than expected. From a change management standpoint, there's certainly times when there's been, we've estimated things a little bit too high, and we've had the opportunity to write up a change order that simply states that the estimated effort for this piece of scope was less than expected, and that creates opportunity for your customers. That creates additional value that maybe they weren't even expecting in the first place. Just things like that, and then we can certainly, that's something we could discuss at great length too. But there's a host of changes that aren't always documented in change orders that should be, that are certainly of benefit to the client in several different ways, either from a time, a schedule, or a budget standpoint.
Right. Wow, that's very honest. That's very honest of you, Adam. But I would expect no less from you. That's really. I'm tempted to talk about the planning for unknown risks, and that sounds like a bit of magic there. But just watching the time, I want to talk about the discovery phase. Maybe that can come. Maybe some that we can talk a little bit about planning for unknown risks as we talk about discovery, if that's possible. So I thought it was interesting because we're like you said, it's not really, the kickoff isn't really a phase. I suppose I should change that slide. But the discovery process is something probably ongoing. Maybe you can tell us what discovery entails, and maybe a little bit about what deliverables or output we would expect to generate during this time, and sort of who's doing that work.
Yep. So this is where, when you really start to define discovery, I think this is where you get into a lot of organizational differences in how they approach, pre-sales, estimation, and then discovery phase of a project. So the caveat to all this being that it's definitely approached differently within different organizations. But I'd say relying on sort of my background and how I typically approach things, discovery is a confirmation of existing assumptions. It's understanding scope at an added level of detail beyond what was defined during estimation. And it's an opportunity to establish expectations and exercise proper change management at an early stage in the project. There's certain things that people would like to believe you cover at the necessary level of depth during during estimation of a project, and I think more often than not, people are surprised, particularly from a client standpoint, obviously. People that are involved in delivery kind of see this time and time again, that estimation doesn't necessarily always get down to the level of detail that you need to actually architect at a very granular level a solution. Now it provides the basis that you can estimate on and develop orders of magnitude and estimate risk and things like that. But there's always a need to, at the beginning of a project, have that discovery period where you take certain areas and expand on them, or maybe receive additional documentation around APIs or things like that that help define exactly what in an agile approach, what user stories would look like, and be able to sort of get it down to that level of detail.
So at this point, your developers are probably using some tool to start gathering user stories. They're starting to gather information. I mean, are you usually using your own project management tools, for clients, or do clients have their own, or do you set up something that's independent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we, for managing sprint schedules and whatnot in an agile approach, we primarily use Jira. We're very open to using other tools, by and large, unless it's a client that has a pretty well-formed IT organization that uses Agile in their own right. by and large, we pretty much rely on our tools that we bring to the table. Obviously, I would advocate for that simply because we're familiar with it. I think it would allow us to be, efficient, across the board in what we do, and just something we're well versed in. That's not to say that we wouldn't be able to to use some other software for whatever reason, but that's what we use. And I think typically, clients are welcoming of sort of your suggestions on what works best based on previous experience and successful delivery.
Right. So then the client would have access to that environment, and they would be able to vote on things or add comments. And is there someone sort of stakeholder on their side that's also communicating directly with the developers, or do you manage all of that? Are you the intermediary for all that contact?
We will usually give access to all of our tools. I think transparency is important, and as a project manager, if we didn't provide that level of access, I would certainly have an added level of overhead associated with communication. So, for starters, somewhat selfishly, it makes my job a little bit easier if other people have visibility into things. I'm not always on the hook for making sure that that things are being communicated on that level. But with that said, just giving people access to tools doesn't necessarily always mean that they use them or log in ever, for that matter. So there is, still some level of onus. It's not something that I can completely defer, but it certainly helps.
Right, okay. I guess we talked a little bit about this. I love what you said, never mistake estimation for discovery. And we did touch on it, but I just wondered if you had anything to add in terms of the process that even the team that worked on estimation, are they usually the same people that work on discovery? Do you use the same developers? Or do we expect that this has to be done with fresh eyes, or the same people who do the building?
Yeah, so they are different roles, and I think in many organizations, that is the case. But we always try and create, gradients between, pre-sales and delivery, so that there is some overlap from a resourcing standpoint for knowledge transfer and things like that. So while they are different roles, within the life cycle of an opportunity, we definitely create those gradients to make sure that people are involved in parallel between some of those transitions. I think what you brought up, the never mistaking estimation for discovery, sometimes depends on the complexity of a project. On a larger project, far too often the stakeholder doesn't understand the level of detail that goes into understanding and preparing a technical approach. I think estimation, like I said before, defines the order of magnitude for what you expect, but discovery is really the basis for how you're actually going to execute beyond a sort of high-level architectural approach. One big major misnomer is just that a sales exercise to determine scope and order of magnitude provides all the level of detail that's needed to being, to architecting a solution from day one. That's not to say that a lot of very relevant and important information is already gathered to that point, but for large-scale projects, there are a lot of reasons to further define scope that might just be simply based around, a lot of time has passed between some of the initial estimations and delivery. There can often be the contractual stage can last up to 6 months, a year even, for that matter, and and a lot of things can change in that time.
Yeah, definitely. And what about some of the, I suppose, you've been sort of addressing this somewhat. We're going to talk about some of the issues with documenting assumptions, et cetera. But what are the risks in this phase that are really the most, sort of the things we can mitigate?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of risks with discovery, but I think the key point being that with a proper kickoff and all that comes with that being the communication plan, change management plan, you should be able to somewhat easily mitigate those risks successfully. And that's once again, it's good that those things are being discussed early on, because it's always a lot easier to deal with any level of change sooner rather than later, as the issue sort of just ends up compounding over time. But there's a host of risks that you could discuss in discovery just around scope and process and expected APIs or endpoints available to you that don't end up being available. All those things that happen quite frequently. But I think that the real point being that if you set some expectations in your kickoff meeting with how you're going to deal with those things, then you should be able to easily mitigate those risks, especially during the discovery phase.
I wonder, this is where it seems like this is getting obviously more Drupal specific, but talking about the third-party APIs, Drupal is being used more and more as like a sort of a grinder for data, and taking in a lot of data and outputting data to different tools and trying to centralize information. And are there sort of, I wonder, like discovery points that you should make sure you've covered? That are Drupal specific, or would that be hard to say, or to generalize, I guess?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm prepared to talk about sort of what all the specific Drupal kind of points are that need to be covered in that case. But I think with any project you're talking about, you need to cover off on dependencies. You need to cover off on, integration points. And I think those aren't necessarily Drupal-specific things, but certainly factors that need to be taken into consideration. And and that's another example of where, I think a lot of people that are involved in the pre-sales process have probably been in a situation where somebody's told them, oh yeah, you'll get all that information from this external web service. They'll give you everything you need. You won't have to do anything with it. And you come to find out that reviewing sort of what those dependencies are and integration points, that that maybe things aren't presented in the format, you're not receiving them in a format that you might have expected, or that's easy for you to transform into the right output and things like that. So I think there are a lot of different areas that need to be covered off on in discovery, and dependencies and integration is just one of those. Migration obviously is something that, depending on the requirements of the project, something that always needs to be discussed at length. But internal policies, there's we could easily have an entire session devoted to that.
We will next week. We're going to be Jakob Suchi is going to come, and we're going to talk about implementation. I think that's where we're going to be kind of digging into some of these issues, and sort of it's probably back to the process will be covered.
I won't steal all of their talking points then. I'll save some of the meat to those calls.
You mentioned something interesting. I was so curious about this, about documenting assumptions. So as I understand, some technical staff, at an early stage of the project say, oh yeah, that's definitely going to take me a day, or time boxing for a certain amount of time. And then, someone else who actually has to build it may not realize, how long it was going to take, or what the assumptions were. What does it look like when you do document these assumptions?
Yeah, well, I think particularly with the assumptions, it all goes back to change management. You can't effectively manage change as a project manager unless you have a set of expectations to manage against. Assumptions are ultimately a way of effectively documenting the starting point with which you base your estimates off of, and then you can reflect on where you are now versus those. And similar to that, once again, this is often perceived as a pitfall for a customer, when in fact it's really an opportunity for them to realize the benefit of efficiencies and reduced scope where that occurs. But I think assumptions are particularly important when you're talking about estimation, simply because you might not have as much detail as you'd always like, and the way you sort of protect yourself in those circumstances is to make sure that you clearly document and outline what assumptions are being made and the impact that those assumptions have to your estimates, and then that gives you the really the reference material that you'll be grateful for down the road.
Right, right. I mean, I suppose you mentioned before, sort of like introducing an agile methodology, and I think I wanted to talk about that in this phase because it seems that, I've seen even on like ZipTech's website says they use a modified agile method, but then I've spoken with agile purists who say, hey, if it's modified, then it's not really agile. And I think there's an issue with sort of cargo cult engineering, sort of, copying or sort of aping the way things, look like they should be done. But what's really happening in the real world in terms of what people are really doing on projects, what methodology actually works with Drupal?
Yep. That's a great question. I'm not going to say that true Agile doesn't work because we've run many successful Agile projects. However, it requires an optimal team makeup in order to effectively do so. To drill down to that a little bit further, partners need to be extremely skilled and versed in Agile, and then part of that is, how our delivery methodology and the fact that we utilize partners, but that's usually not an issue. We have a multitude of partners that are extremely well versed in Agile methodology, but more importantly and often overlooked, we're more dependent really on the customers to implement an effective Agile methodology. Clients, while they often request Agile methodology because they have read about the efficiencies and benefits gained from an Agile methodology, I think more often than not, rarely understand what it truly means to be Agile. And that, for the most part, comes down to one reason primarily, and that's the frequency and involvement in communication and the level of necessary touch points that we require from the client on a day-to-day basis. It's not just the primary stakeholders that need to be intimately involved on a day-to-day basis. It's the entire project team, and oftentimes when we when we start to send out the daily Scrum meetings, as well as among project leadership, your weekly, biweekly, twice weekly status meetings and whatnot, they quickly realize how much of their schedule is consumed by these touch points, and that's an integral part to being successful with an Agile methodology. The other component is lots of times approval and acceptance gates in a large organization aren't well suited for Agile methodology simply because there's far too many gates of approval needed to do things and turn things around as efficiently as they need to be, even if you have that process extremely well defined. I think it boils down to lots of clients quickly realize that they simply don't have the time and resources to be able to facilitate the amount of touch points required for an Agile approach, because oftentimes those stakeholders are juggling multiple projects themselves.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose that's why it sounds like you also have to be flexible in that change management process, and it kind of makes sense that you have to be able to draw a line at some point and say, this is where we're at, and if we discover later on that, things have to change, that's fine, but a fully Agile process sounds like it takes a lot of trust as well. So,
just to touch Heather real quick on, I think in many ways we do then derive from that, do take a bit of a hybrid or modified Agile approach, and that obviously, works very successfully as well, and has on many large engagements that I've been involved in that have been successful to date. So I think it's really just setting expectations on what's required in different scenarios, and working with what you got, and figuring out what the optimal solution is. So I'm not saying one doesn't work, one does work. It's just making sure that you accurately assess the situation and implement the correct solution.
Right. I know in our last session, Jen Ceramic's coming. I think she's an Agile. I should actually know the title, but she's got her certification as an Agile project manager. So I'm really keen to hear how that works.
Yeah. Jen is a well-versed Scrum Master.
Yeah, Scrum Master. That's it there. Well, for folks who are following along, we're going to open up for questions now. And for people who are watching the recording, you'll see the link down there at the bottom. That goes to a blog post where you can ask questions even if you're watching the recording, and we'll be able to get back to you. But throughout this week, and you come back next week, take a chance to think about your own project management process with a current client, and think about your own kickoff calls and how you hold them, what gets covered, and have you ever discovered any hidden stakeholders. And did you have a clear plan for change management? And how do you document your assumptions? So we'd like to open up, because we have about 10 minutes now, for any questions. Hannah, sorry. I'm thinking about Amy Scabarda. Were there any questions?
Yeah, we had a couple come in. So the first one is, I was wondering what your thoughts are regarding the need for a face-to-face kickoff meeting, especially when teams are not co-located during the project.
Mm-hmm. So my short answer is that I always recommend a face-to-face meeting. I think there's just a lot to be obtained from not only face-to-face kickoffs, but various face-to-face touch points throughout the project. I have a lot of team members that work remotely on most of my projects, and that obviously, particularly from a delivery standpoint within the project team, I have other remote team members, and they certainly appreciate the value of having those face-to-face opportunities. But I think I mentioned earlier that I do think the importance of that varies a little bit with the size of the project team. But I would, without question, always recommend those face-to-face opportunities, whether it's project kickoff, major reviews, milestones in the project. You'll always be able to accomplish, I think, just a little bit more when you get everybody around a table than on a conference call when it's real easy to be distracted and have your IM and email in front of you at the same time. But obviously, circumstances are different, and you kind of need to talk about what makes the most sense for your project team.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. The next question is, what kind of questions should we be asking during kickoff meetings specific to Drupal projects?
Well, I think one of the things that I always make sure I ask across the board with every project is, well, first of all, assuming you have the right audience there, and that includes, I'm focusing more on the project leadership side of things. Oftentimes there's a level of project sponsor that's, was maybe the one signing the check in the first place, and they come to the project kickoff to be a part of the team, get things going, and then frankly, they only hear about things going forward unless something needs to be escalated. But using that opportunity, one of the questions I always ask, or I always elicit some level of feedback from those project sponsors around what what their business objectives are. And I think that's important, not just for the successful delivery of the project, but you'd be surprised how often we as project managers are also somewhat facilitating communication within an organization. And it might not necessarily sound directly related to kind of what our roles and responsibilities are, but if anything, it's an opportunity, I think, for many of the project team members to hear from their senior that what the real objectives are and what's trying to be accomplished. So that's, I think, one thing. And the business objectives section of the kickoff agenda that I always ask, and then corollary to that, what are the measurements for success? And that really gets everybody on the same page for what we're trying to accomplish. And I talk about how we're going to accomplish it, but then ultimately, how are we going to be graded on our success? And I never, once again, pretend to know the organization I'm working with as well as they do, and I think it's extremely important to hear that from them.
That's interesting. I have some questions. I don't know if there's any other questions from the group.
Yeah, there are.
Good.
So the next question is, what is the biggest challenge in the discovery process when detailing highly specific data requirements for web display?
Could you say that question once more? I just want to make sure I got
Yeah.
the right.
What is the biggest challenge in the discovery process when detailing highly specific data requirements for web display?
So that's a question that I honestly wish I had kind of one of my technical architects to answer from a data gathering standpoint. But I guess looking at it, if we're kind of talking from a migration standpoint, I think in terms of how we're gathering that data, importing it into Drupal, whether we're coming from a different CMS or just a proprietary system, then we ultimately some of the kind of key things that we like to obtain from that is making sure that that they've done they being the client has done some level of investigation in terms of how their current state would map to future state, and then also done some due diligence around you're never going to have a better opportunity to really audit your current content and determine what is relevant to move forward with and what might need to be rewritten, whether it's because it's outdated or just simply needs to be rewritten. I'm making sure that they've taken full advantage of that opportunity to perform a content analysis. So I'd apologize if that didn't directly answer your question, but I think that's definitely an important thing to bring up and talk about.
Okay, great. The next question is, who decides whether a project is agile, the project team or the stakeholder?
That's a great question. I think it's an open discussion about what the benefits are of agile methodology, as well as what the risks are. And I think I don't know that it's one party's decision, although that goes back to lots of times there are clients that are sort of more hands-off than others and say, all I want is for you to ensure that this project is going to be successful and be clear about what the expected outcomes are, and you run it the way you need to run it, because part of the reason they are inevitably probably selecting you as a partner is because you have proven success in the past, and they certainly want to leverage that in any methodologies or anything that have helped you prove your success in the past. But I think, generally speaking, I want it to be an open discussion, particularly if we're going with agile methodology for the points that I mentioned previously around making sure that people understand what that really means and what the expectations are of the client in terms of communication, approvals, acceptance, and other things of that nature. So I think we'll certainly make our recommendations based on the experience and knowledge that we're bringing to the table. But with I think any important decision in a project, you want it to be a mutual one, and you want the client to feel involved in that decision so that they understand the basis for it. And if you need to change your path at any point down the road, they can understand what warranted changing direction and how that maybe didn't meet initial expectations to do so.
Awesome, thanks. The next question is, can you talk more about change management plans and how you define what constitutes a change order? We often run into a slippery slope situation in which a small change is totally doable, but leads to the impression that we can change anything.
Yep, that is a great and very loaded question. So change management, I think, is something that everybody wants to make the client happy. Everybody wants to say, yes, we can do that. We can deliver maybe more value than we even expected, and that's great. That's what ultimately we want to bring the greatest amount of value that we can during the successful delivery of a project. But I think with that comes needs to come an expectation that change simply needs to be documented. And I think part of how I deal with that is, it's early on in the project, you take advantage of certain opportunities to set expectations, because if you overlook an opportunity early in the project to, say, create a zero bill change order, that simply documents that, in the contract it was written in the statement of work that, this particular scope item was going to be delivered this way, and maybe it's just simply a 5-minute conversation and everybody agrees on, well, it makes more sense for us to go this approach, and it's, same level of effort, somewhat negligible in terms of the overall context of the project, but I will write up a change order that that essentially documents that was a change in scope, and it is a zero bill change order, and that goes back to sort of helping your clients feel comfortable with that process that you've outlined in your change management plan, and having gone through that process and something that may seem somewhat arbitrary, so that if you are midstream on a project and there's a much more significant change in scope, that you've been through that before and you've been able to help them see the positive nature of change orders and how they actually benefit the projects, and just get everybody comfortable with that. I think in terms of what can you write a change order for, it's sort of limitless. I think the obvious ones are any changes to effort, scope, budget, timelines, dependencies. The list goes on. Basically anything that you assumed early on or was a factor or variable in determining the level of effort or anything like that impacts the project is a change to the project, and that's fine. It gives you, it's an opportunity is what it is.
I like the
Great.
positive.
Thanks.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much. All right, we had a couple more questions. The next one is, does the discovery phase happen after kickoff?
Yep. So I would, yes. So I would have the kickoff to set some expectations around. This is how we're going to go about communicating. Everything that we've already kind of briefly touched on in the agenda, and then following that would be the discovery phase. And part of the real importance of that ordering of things is the fact that the discovery or confirmation of requirements, depending on how in depth you want to go, it might just be a one-day meeting to go through the scope as it's been defined and talk through each of the bullet points and expectations on how things are going to be approached and what integration points are going to be used and things like that. But that probably more than any point in the project is where you're going to exercise the change management plan. So you want to be sure going into that you've had that opportunity to review the change management plan and already previously outlined the process, get buy-in from the necessary parties, and and have that opportunity. Now, it somewhat depends on if we're talking, true discovery versus some people like to call discovery, the estimation process, in which case that could affect the order a little bit. But, I'd say in your typical project, yes, you'd have your kickoff before your discovery, since that allows you to effectively manage any change or anything that would come out of discovery.
Awesome, thanks. How would you just summarize the discover phase in one sentence?
I would say it somewhat depends, and I already know I've surpassed my one sentence limit here, but it somewhat depends on the level of estimation and how granular you went into the discovery phase. But I would say if I were to boil it down to a sentence, I would say it's an opportunity to confirm any existing assumptions and or requirements and expand upon those that did not have a significant amount of depth already to them. So that's it's really an opportunity to, like I said, go through and if anything, just confirm your understanding and make sure everything is still relevant, everything's current state. And then hopefully it goes as smoothly as just confirming those things. But I think it's not rare that would turn into an opportunity to talk about things in more detail and expand upon things that let's be honest, might have a bullet point associated with them that really needs a lot more definition. So you can there's no better time to talk about those things than than at that time.
Awesome, thank you. The last question is, can you talk more specifically about what's typically involved in the discovery phase, usability testing, content audit, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So I think that, once again, that sort of depends on what you're contracted for and what services you're providing. From a Drupal implementation standpoint, the discovery phase is really getting at understanding the technical requirements and understanding the those integration points that we talked about, and I'd say less. And this might just be kind of the types of projects that Acquia engages in. I'm sure there's agencies out there that are more involved in sort of the design side of things, and that's that I think adds its own kind of component to things where, during your discovery phase, I think that definitely would be where you would perform some user analysis and get a little bit more into the user experience side of things. But whether it's user personas and things like that, you are sort of discovering ultimately what's going to set the baseline for your project going forward. But I'd say majority of my projects during the discovery phase, I am mostly focused on technical requirements, and then also if designs are already complete, ideally, and signed off on and accepted prior to the kickoff, then discovery, an important part of discovery, not only reviewing the scope as it's been documented to date, but also reviewing the designs. This is kind of an important point that I don't think I've touched on too much, but reviewing the designs to make sure that they mirror up with the scope as it's been defined as well. And oftentimes, I think as we all know, there's not a designer out there that wants to be constrained in terms of what they can do or how they do it, and so it's it's not to say that we don't want to or can or are going to build the coolest stuff around, but we just need to make sure that that's accounted for, in not just the budget, but from a project schedule standpoint and things like that.
All right, awesome. I think we're going to have to sign off now because we're over, but I would definitely, I'll forward all the rest of the questions to Adam, and then maybe we can post them after. And thank you so much, Adam and Heather, for the wonderful presentation and all the information. And thanks, everyone, for attending. Again, slides and recording of the webinar will be posted to the Acquia.com website in the next 48 hours. Heather, Adam, do you want to end with anything?
Well, I would just say follow the link in the presentation, check out the blog where you can ask more questions and get some follow-up. You'll see the list of questions that we covered in the recording. We'll put the presentation there, and we'll have some more resources for you. There were some folks asking about more books and resources, and I will have loads of more information on this blog post for you really soon.
Yep, and I can provide some of those, help you get some of those resources together as well, Heather, because I've certainly had my fair share of books and things that I've found useful as it specifically pertains to Drupal projects. And
I've got, I think,
everyone for your time.
In preparation for
thanks so much.
A lot of material. So, sorry. See you next week, folks.